Hello and welcome to our CMT podcast. This is episode 10 on Where We're Going.
And I'm Alison Kavanagh.
So we're going to do things a little bit differently, I think, in this episode because we're both kind of focused on the same topic, kind of two elements. We're going to talk a little bit about ultra-processed food, and then you particularly want to talk about
Fats and oils.
fats and oils. Yeah, yeah. So it's going to be quite interesting. Very much kind of, I suppose, a you might say nutrition focus for this particular podcast.
Yeah.
So I think the first point we were talking about was the ultra processed foods because people are becoming more and more aware of that. Fortunately, there's a lot of coverage of it in media and things like that and in podcasts. A lot of people are talking about ultra processed foods, but sometimes kind of skirt around the definition and even what's good and what's bad. That sometimes people want an overly simplistic explanation. Just tell me is it good or tell me is it bad? And there's
Nuances,
nuance. Yeah,
for sure.
nuance that gets lost that can make a big difference because it's not all good or all bad in most circumstances. Although we would say ultra processed food, really not good for you.
Hmm.
And again, it doesn't mean never eat it, but it means really limit the intake and know why as well. So that there might be times when, other factors aren't having much of an impact. Your health is actually pretty good. You're going to tolerate a little bit of unhealthy stuff
Hmm.
pretty well.
Yeah.
But then other times when your health is compromised, you're talking about this about being on like a knife's edge.
Yeah. Sometimes when things are on a knife edge and you have a lot of sensitivities, any little thing can set off inflammation in the body and cause a whole cascade of symptoms. So,
Yeah, so we'd want to really take a look at those. So I suppose starting off, we'd say, how do we define ultra processed food? So it can be defined as foods that are highly altered. So not in their natural state.
yeah.
Our dad used to talk about this a lot with the eat foods as close to their natural state as possible, just as a general kind of rule of thumb. So they're highly altered. They typically contain a lot of added salt, sugar, fat. And the big thing I think is the industrial chemical additives.
Yes.
So they oftentimes they'll say like a simple definition is it's things that aren't made from just raw ingredients,
Yeah.
the kind of raw ingredients that you typically find in your kitchen.
Yes.
Yeah. So I suppose then those elements we could say salt, sugar, the industrial chemical additives, and then fat is the big one we're going to focus on in this particular episode.
Hmm.
But I suppose to talk about salt because not all salt is the same.
No, it's not all created equally.
Yeah. So salt is generally derived from minerals, usually sodium and potassium.
Hmm.
And to be honest, even like good sea salt has more sodium than potassium, but the ratio is important. I always found it fascinating that they'd say like a pint of seawater has the same chemical constituents to a large extent, certainly trace elements, as a pint of blood,
Yeah.
and in the same ratio.
Yeah.
So this is why sea salt would be particularly good, that it is mostly sodium, but has the correct proportion of potassium for our bodies to really make use of it.
Yeah.
Now, what I thought was interesting is that a lot of table salt is either pure sodium, it's oftentimes mined rather than being gotten from the sea.
Yeah.
And they oftentimes then will remove what they consider to be impurities, which are oftentimes trace elements that might be beneficial.
Yeah.
And the big thing is the adding of anti-caking agents.
Yeah.
So things that are going to stop the salt from clumping together, any kind of moisture that might get in and would affect its granular form. So they want to try and keep it as fine as possible. So they'll have these anti-caking agents. So when we were looking at it, we said like really the ideal types of salt, like some mined salts, like Himalayan sea salt.
Yeah.
Interesting, I saw a thing where they were saying that, well, it has a certain amount of contaminants from the atmosphere,
Yeah.
but I think it's still far less than commercially produced table salt.
Yes.
And what's used in industrial processes in making processed food is always going to be the cheapest version,
Yeah.
which the focus is not on health, it's on cheap.
Yeah.
And so you'll oftentimes get an unhealthy alternative simply because it's cheaper. And so it's generally that kind of table salt, that processed, mined, pure sodium salt that's used. And that tends to get a bad rep.
Yeah. So I think it's looking at what are the best options there.
Yeah.
And they often talk about Celtic sea salt as being a pretty good option.
Yes.
I know we're in Ireland and,
No bias involved. It is genuine. Yes.
and the pink Himalayan sea salt is pretty good. So just things, again, as close to their natural state as possible.
Mm. And they said traditionally as well, things that were oftentimes used to prevent caking was they would add like grains of rice
Yeah.
because rice will absorb the moisture so that the salt grains don't,
Yeah, don't
and they
stick together.
stay crystalline and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. I think overall, though, like we say, everything in moderation. And really, what I wanted to focus in on is the main things that really affect our health and are well-being and our longevity. And I think really the two culprits are sugar and fats.
Mm,
Fats is such a huge, complicated subject. We want to
yeah.
simplify that as much as possible. But just something like sugar, they say table sugar, your liver can metabolize 6 teaspoons in one day. And if you look at a soda or a fizzy drink, they can contain, one can contain up to 10 teaspoons of sugar, and
Yeah.
you're well over
Way over.
the daily limit.
Mm.
And then there's other brands that are maybe targeted at teenagers and younger, and they've
The energy
14
drinks.
energy drinks and so on, and they've 14 teaspoons in one drink. And if you're drinking multiples of those, I just think you're setting yourself up for problems down the road.
Mm.
So there's like 56 names for sugar on labeling. So it can be even a little bit difficult to identify the amount of sugar we're actually getting,
Mm.
apart from the obvious. So it's just being mindful of that. And I would think drink water instead of your fizzy drinks
Mm.
optimally.
One thing I'd say about the salt, though, before we really get into sugar, because
Yeah,
that's a whole nother area, is that salt is really being demonized a lot at the moment. And the fact is, we need salt. It
yeah,
is essential for health. These are minerals that our body requires to function.
nerve
So that's
conduction.
why you want good salt
Yeah,
for the salt that you are taking in.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Sorry. That was an interesting point, though, about the sugars, that just one can, and people will oftentimes have more than one in a day, just one can, if you're thinking like it's almost the same again, it's almost double your allowance. If you're talking at 6 to 10,
Yeah,
close enough to double, not
yeah,
quite. But at 14,
yeah,
you're way over double the amount of sugar.
yeah.
Again,
From
in
one
one can.
one serving. So it's pretty crazy. But I think what happened then in the food industry, fat was kind of vilified, and fat was seen as bad for you, but kind of in the 60s and 70s.
Mm,
And because they removed fat from food to go low fat, it became unpalatable.
mm,
So they start putting sugar in instead of the fat, and you're like, okay.
mm.
I think that was a major error in the food industry and the effects on health and longevity. And it has just caused a cascade of problems because of that.
Mm.
And fats are so complicated, it's never black and white. There's a whole spectrum from the really, really healthy fats, like the omega-3s that found in fish oil. So things like eating fish even twice a week would meet our requirement for EPA and DHA. So salmon, trout, mackerel, those kind of ones, ideally wild rather than farmed. Unfortunately, the farmed ones are fed grains. Like I never heard of fish eating corn, but
Oh yeah, farmer fish. Yeah.
so wild where possible. So you have the really, really important good oils, EPA, DHA, and then all the way down to the very damaged oils, the trans fats. I think Dr. Robert Lustig is really worth investigating. He's an endocrinologist. He's put an awful lot of a neuroendocrinologist, and has specialized in pediatrics as well. But he really puts a lot of time and effort into explaining on all different levels what the different oils are. So he names the 7 different types of oils, and going from the very, very best, the omega-3s, to the worst offenders.
Mm. I keep jumping back. So I'm thinking just of sugars, like some of the kind of high points to bear in mind is you were saying that you oftentimes are taking in sugars and not realizing it because of labeling.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not by accident. It's oftentimes because sugary foods are more appealing and because people are becoming more aware of the importance of limiting those processed sugars, their labeling is becoming more and more obscured. And, they always say like simple thing when you're reading labels is they're listed in descending order of how much of that item there is in the product. So if sugar is first on the list, it's mostly sugar. It's the biggest proportion of what the thing is. And we said there are 56 different names used in labeling that are all sugars. But the simple kind of giveaway is usually things will end in A's. So like maltase, lactase, all these different things. If it's got A's in it, it's a
Okay.
sugar. Or if it has malt as well,
Yeah.
because malt is sugar as well.
Oh,
So os, what did I
oh,
say?
I
Oh, I
see.
said A's.
A's
A's
of
is
enzymes.
enzymes.
Yeah.
Os, sorry,
Yeah.
lactose.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anything with os at the end
Yes.
is going to be sugars. So the refined sugars that we'll oftentimes see is cane sugar, corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup, glucose, dextrose. These are all just sugar.
maltodextrose.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So anytime you
Franken
see,
sugars,
yeah,
unfortunately.
oats or malt, it's a sugar.
Yeah.
And so sometimes, so that sugar isn't the first ingredient, they will say uh, refined corn syrup somewhere, then dextrose might be fourth, and then
Sugar
maltose
cane.
somewhere else, and then sugar cane. So they're breaking the sugars out so that they appear further down the list.
Yeah.
But if you were to combine them all into sugars, it really would be first.
Yeah.
So look at not just for sugars in labeling, but also how many times a type of sugar is mentioned.
Yeah.
And I thought it was really interesting that they said that in terms of damage to your health and in terms of, I suppose, cost to like the HSE here or any of the health services, they would say that sugar is actually more damaging to your health than alcohol. Like we think about the taxes on alcohol and things like that, rightly so, to pay for the medical attention that people are going to need. People do fall into alcoholism and things like that. That they would say that it is quite a cost or a burden on society for maintaining of health services, which is required. We're not arguing that,
Hmm.
but it's that you then will have similar, but maybe not as clearly recognized hidden costs in dealing with the long-term negative effects of a high sugar diet.
Yeah.
So sugar being more damaging than alcohol.
Yeah, it's quite alarming, like where they said that typically they'd see fatty livers associated with alcoholics.
Mhm.
Now they're seeing as young as 5-year-olds in the States with fatty liver syndrome, similar to that of an alcoholic because of the amount of sugar in the diet.
And if that was from alcohol consumption, there'd be an absolute outcry.
Outcry.
A 5-year-old alcoholic, that'd be horrendous.
Yeah.
But when it's sugar, it goes beneath the radar,
Yeah, yeah.
which is
So
quite surprising.
getting a lot more mindful about the sugar intake and the detrimental effects on the liver. But
Yeah.
I think on from that, the other big one is fats, and it's
Mm.
so complex. One of the earliest books that I read on fats was by Udo Erasmus. You may be familiar with Udo's Oils. Fascinating guy. We saw him here in Dublin in the early 90s, and he gave a fantastic talk on the different types of oils, how they were produced, how they affected health, and so on. And he was just way ahead of his time. And it's only now people are coming back and kind of going, wait a minute, this guy really had it nailed.
I think we were fortunate because of how we were brought up. We were very much on the same page back then. But I remember, I'm kind of smiling because I remember at the time, like the questions that were asked, and I'm sure Udo was like, really? Somebody asked, like, hold on. What do you mean protein? Now people are much more aware. There's so
Better
much a
formed.
focus on making sure you get enough protein in your diet and what the best protein sources are. But somebody literally was like, whoa, slow down there, college boy. What's with this protein? So it is interesting to see how things have changed.
Yeah,
But he was saying that back in the 90s, very much on the same kind of page as our dad would have been and how we would have been brought up. Yeah,
absolutely.
fascinating.
So the fats that heal, fats that kill, it sounds kind of dramatic, but when you look at where he was going with it, he was absolutely right. He was talking about, what are the needs for fats in the diet, and we have everything from fats are needed for our cell membranes. So literally every cell in the body of the 50 trillion cells we have has a phospholipid membrane, and the body will use whatever oils are available to build into those cells. So if you have healthy oils, it's going to have a well intact cell membrane. And that means like viruses and bacteria find it harder to penetrate the cell. Whereas if you're getting a lot of damaged oils or rancid oils, they are then built into the cell membranes and we're more susceptible to illnesses.
Yeah. I thought it was fascinating that the first chapter or two in Udo's book seems very complex. It gets very readable. It's still recommended now, even though it was written like 40 years ago. Still brilliant information. But he talked about the lengths of the carbon chains and different types of oils. Some are very long chain, some are very short chain.
Hmm.
And what was particularly being talked about, like the unsaturated fats,
Yeah.
the likes of olive oil and things like that, which are great oils,
Yeah.
but people were assuming then that that was good for everything. And a lot of people cook with olive oil. But his point was the longer the carbon chain, the more it is damaged through the heating process.
Yes, if it has a double bond,
Yeah, and the shorter
the
chains
flip.
didn't tend to mutate as much.
Hmm.
And the way I used to explain this in a classroom, because people, you start talking about carbon chains and lengths of carbon chains,
Yeah, and
something being
methylated
six
groups.
and eight and double sided and all the rest.
Yeah.
I remember growing up as a kid and playing with Lego, and you had different length bricks.
Hmm.
And you needed quite a range so that you had the right brick to fit to make the thing you were trying to produce. And I remember thinking, oh, adding heat literally twists the carbon chain. So it's going, well, that's like having one of those long Lego blocks, taking a lighter to it, and it would melt the plastic so it deformed and twisted out of shape.
Yeah.
So if you were to try and build something with that, it now doesn't fit in. There'd be gaps in whatever you're trying to build.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a short block couldn't twist as much.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it melted a little bit, it would still fit. The gaps wouldn't be there so much.
Yeah.
So that's how I related to it, that when you added heat, you literally, and I mean, they can see this under a microscope, it would twist the carbon chains. And so it no longer forms the membrane of that cell wall. Because when we say phospholipid, that's just a phosphorus molecule, and lipid is the term for a fat.
Yeah.
So the fats would be bent and they would leave gaps in the cell wall,
Mm-hmm.
gaps in the defense, because that's like your skin,
Mm-hmm.
be like an open wound.
Mm.
That the skin of the cell, that fat and phosphorus membrane, is to protect the internal environment from anything that might be in the external environment, in the same way that our skin protects what's in our body from the things that are outside.
Mm-hmm.
So having those twisted oils, it'd be like having major gashes in
Mm-hmm.
your skin, access routes for invading particles to get in and create infection and damage the organism.
Mm-hmm.
This is on a cellular level, damaging individual cells.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's widespread enough, that's going to cause major health issues.
Yeah.
And I'd always think of the thing of the protective mechanism of the fats being really important at that kind of cellular level, that your body has to have some fat. So if it only has damaged fats, it's going to use that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But if it has good fats available, of course it's going to choose the premium, the best it has
Yeah.
for the best defense.
Yeah, and even down to the fact that the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, can't break down damaged fats, particularly trans fats, the Franken fats as we call them, or the the really
Yeah.
diabolical fats that they can remain in the body long term.
Mm.
They just get stuck in the liver. Anyway, we could absolutely get lost in fats, but basically we want like heart healthy fats. What are the healthy fats? What are the worst offenders? So we mentioned,
Well, it's talking about the functions, like what fats are for.
yeah, the cell membrane.
Getting past the demonization that happened of fats, where it was all around fats are bad for you, fats make you fat, fats cause heart attacks.
Yeah,
When
everything
we
should
look
be
at the
low.
list of what the body actually needs or uses fats for,
Yeah, nerve insulation, the myelin on the nerve, it's like if you can think of a wiring in a house, you have the copper wire and then you have the insulation around it. The fatty insulation, the myelin, is really integral for how effectively our nervous system can
so
operate.
the plastic coating on household wiring, the equivalent in the body is a fat that's covering the wire, the nerve.
Yeah, to
So
insulate that
that's what you need the fat for.
and to help with nerve conduction and
Mm.
signaling and so on. Obviously, very important for brain function, hormone production. We mentioned energy, the mitochondria, protecting organs, the absorption of other oily nutrients like vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, things that are really important for all the linings in the body, both internal and external. Roles in immune function, eye function, skin, cholesterol production, the cardiovascular we mentioned, and even in gene regulation. So, I mean, the importance of good quality fats in the diet is really
Mm.
wide reaching. And I think if you've enough healthy fats in the diet, you remain more youthful for longer.
Mm.
Like it really does affect your how quickly you age.
Yeah. Well, when we talk about like the oils being the cell wall, your whole body is made up of cells,
Hmm.
cells and fibers,
Yeah.
and ground substance, water. But cells are everywhere. So the more delicate tissues, like you think about how squishy your eye is, how delicate it is, or
The
things like the
brain.
kidney, liver, the brain is like a big blancmange. So the more delicate tissues, it oftentimes shows in first.
Yeah.
So the quality of the eyesight, the functioning of the eye, the flexibility within the iris to focus and control light and all that kind of stuff, light sensitivity.
Yeah.
A lot of that is really requires a lot of suppleness within those cells.
Absolutely.
So some cells maybe it might not be as quick to show,
Hmm.
and then other cells it's going to show really fast. And I
Really
always think of those
quickly.
delicate tissues
Yeah.
as the ones to show deficiencies or poor quality fats the soonest.
Absolutely. So we were talking about those 7 different oils, different categories that they fall into, and it can get quite complex and when you dive into the chemistry of the oils and so on. But I think it's useful to know the worst offenders. So particularly the seed oils have been highlighted recently in terms of bowel cancer, cardiovascular problems, and generally promoting inflammation in the body. So they're classed as omega-6, and generally we've far more omega-6 compared to omega-3. The ratio should be 2 to 1, twice as much omega-6 as omega-3, but we have like 18 to 1 in some cases. Like it's
Okay.
way out of whack, the amount of vegetable oil. And then within that, you have the vegetable oil and the seed oils that are high in omega-6. Then as they're processed
Mm.
and heat is applied to them, they're then damaged, and then they can be further damaged by heating when they're used for cooking.
Mm.
So you're really getting a lot, they're quite unstable, the seed oils, and I think that's why they can be so toxic.
Yeah, and the long chains.
The longer chains, yeah, polyunsaturated. So just to give an example of what some of the seed oils are, we have rapeseed oil, known as canola oil in the States, um, corn oil, grapeseed, peanut oil, and palm kernel oil, sunflower, safflower, and soya bean oil, rice bran oil, and probably the worst offender, cottonseed oil.
Yeah.
Who eats cotton?
Yeah. It's quite shocking, really.
Yeah,
That, and even the difference between, like, say, olive oil would fall into that category. I even thought that was interesting about the ratios, because you'd say it's not that all seed oils or plant oils are going to be bad. It's how they're processed and the quantities.
yes,
Because it really ties back into what we said about the salt. You do need some sodium. You need more sodium than potassium, but you need them in a particular ratio.
yes,
And if the ratio becomes unbalanced, then that becomes a problem.
sure.
So you do actually need omega-6s. It should be a 1 to 2, or a, what did you say, 3 to 6?
3 to 1,
Three to
two
one,
to one, three, yeah,
thereabouts.
2 to 1, three
Yeah.
to 1 is ideal.
60-40. Yeah. So 2 to 3. um, but the point I would make about the cotton seed and things like that is most plants don't want the seed um, to be eaten. So olive oil is different because it isn't produced from the hard seed within the olive. It's actually produced from the fleshy part of the olive. So it's totally different. The plant wants animals to eat the fruit, the fleshy part. So it distributes the seed
Mm,
so that it can grow another plant.
yeah,
It doesn't want you eating the seed. And so it actually adds in chemical compounds to make it
unpalatable.
unpalatable, hard to digest, upsets normal biological processes because they don't want you eating the seed.
Yeah,
So olive oil is very different because it's from the flesh. Then you have the idea that if you are going to extract a seed oil from something like a cotton plant, which was never a food crop, but if you were going to extract the oil, this is where the industrial processing comes in and comes back to nearly the industrial additives that we talked about, that these things are very cheap to produce because they're largely waste products, but they're not suitable for human consumption. So they go through a lot of processing, like in a big oil refinery. Like, it's a very industrial process. You wouldn't be doing this at home.
no,
And they will heat and cool and extract and put through chemical processes, chemical cleaning agents,
bleach.
bleaches, deodorizers, removing what they consider to be impurities, which sometimes are actually beneficial stuff, but
Yeah, it could be
might
in
actually have
fiber.
shortened the shelf life or something like that,
Yeah,
cause it to go off sooner, or
yeah,
for your senses to detect that this was off sooner.
yes,
So that's an impurity
yeah,
because it makes it a less commercially stable product.
yeah,
And then it can be whatever they said. They can literally manipulate those oils in that refining process to produce any texture, so any viscosity,
mm-hmm,
any flavor, because they could just add a flavor in,
mm-hmm,
but also any burning point, or what they call a smoke point of oils.
mm-hmm,
So typically, again, those long carbon chains will tend to smoke more quickly when heated.
yes,
So when they alter these oils, particularly the likes of the cottonseed oil, the reason it's so popular is because they can, in that refining process, make it that it has a really high smoke point.
yes,
So it can be heated higher for longer and still not give the game away of how bad it is for you.
yeah,
So it's really a way of tricking our senses that we've developed over millennia, our sight, our sense of smell, our touch, our taste, that would normally tell us this is not food.
yeah,
They're being tricked, they're being bypassed.
yeah. I think where I became aware of the cottonseed oil was I do like crisps and corn chips and potato chips. And I just, you like them with the nibbles and dips and so on. And I found with the eczema, within 5 minutes of eating corn chips or crisps, the skin was just on fire. It was so inflamed and so irritated.
Mm.
I was going, what are they cooking these in that I get that immediate a reaction to them?
Yeah.
And then I realized they were using cottonseed oil to cook a lot of potato chips or crisps, as we call them here,
Mm.
and corn chips. And the oils are just lethal. They draw out your own natural oils, as well as taking in the damaged oil.
Yeah.
Just have to steer clear from those.
Yeah. And again, they're used because they're cheap. There isn't any other benefit. It's just cheap. It's money saving to try and drive greater profitability.
Yeah,
And I think every company needs to be able to produce profit in order to survive. But when you are maximizing profit to the point that your product is compromised, that's where I feel the economics don't really add up. That's when it becomes really detrimental to society, you could say, at large.
yeah. And so I suppose people always want to know, well, what do I do instead? So I think a good rule of thumb is to use vegetable oils at room temperature where possible. So like olive oil, to use it at room temperature, it's not going to be damaged, especially if it's extra virgin olive oil. If you are going to cook with oils, they actually say butter, olive oil, or coconut oil.
Not of
Olive
for
oil, I
cooking.
think if you mix it with water, they say
Oh,
that
of course, yeah.
the water, if you put some water, like a teaspoon of water in with 3 teaspoons of olive oil, the water will stop the olive oil from hitting the smoke point.
Mm,
It'll only go as far as the boiling point of water.
yeah.
And in traditional Thai cooking, they tend to use water to prevent the oils from reaching a smoke point where the oil is damaged, and yet they can have quite high temperatures to
Cook the
quickly
food.
cook
Mm,
the food.
yeah.
Um, so I think the medium chain is less prone to damage, the coconut oil.
Mm.
It
Short.
might, it's a medium chain is MCT oil. Yeah, is medium chain coconut oil.
Oh, I don't think it was short chain because it's like about 6 or 8 carbon.
Bonds for coconut
Yeah.
oil.
It's in the lower end of the spectrum anyway,
Yeah,
somewhere either side of butter. I think is butter 6 maybe,
6. Yeah,
and it might be 8,
yeah.
and is
I thought it was maybe 12, but anyway, we can work
uh,
out the
yeah,
logistics.
yeah,
It's
um,
solid at room temperature anyway. It's not liquid at
yeah,
room temperature.
yeah. As opposed to a lot of the seed oils that you're going to see in a supermarket,
Yeah,
they're always going to be liquid.
yeah,
Yeah, and they
exactly.
tend to have more the longer chains. I don't know if they actually call them long chain.
Well, when it's polyunsaturated, poly meaning
Yeah.
many, and then unsaturated is the type of bonds between
Mm,
the carbons and so on. So I think the what we want is the as the takeaways are to eat healthy fats where possible. So the extra virgin olive oil, particularly for salad dressings and so on, and that it's fresh and doesn't smell rancid.
mm,
The eating avocados, you're getting kind of omega 9s in those as well.
mhm.
That's going to be a really good source of healthy fats. Raw nuts and whole seeds. Again, with the nuts, really the ideal would be to crack the shell open and eat them fresh
Yeah.
out of the nut. Definitely not dry roasted or any of the other processing that can go on with nuts. So if you can get raw nuts that are within a reasonable shelf life, that
But
would be
again,
really good.
it comes back to what Dad used to say about eat foods as close to their natural state. So the food in its shell, the shell is actually protecting it from oxygenation, from exposure to the air,
Yeah,
because the air will start to turn the fat. It will begin the process of turning rancid,
yeah,
going off,
yeah,
same as any food.
yeah,
So if it's encapsulated within its shell, there's a much slower process. But again, how long has that shell been around? Is it, 5 years since it's been harvested? But anyway, assuming it's relatively recently, it has that layer of protection.
yeah,
But unfortunately, we tend to go more and more for convenience. And cracking shells on some nuts is awkward.
yeah,
So, oh, let's make it easier. And they remove the shell. It's like, well, you've removed a layer of protection. You've removed it one step from its natural state.
yeah,
Well, 2 steps, because it was part of the plant. It's been picked, one
yeah,
step removed, still good. Removed from its shell, starting to oxygenate, not quite so good, and it depends on how long it's out of its shell. And then if you go heating it to dry roast it or roasted and salted or whatever it might be, you've now further heated and damaged those fats, and it's really not a health product anymore.
yeah, absolutely. So, uh, again, a little bit of anything is no harm. Keeping things in moderation is important.
Mm.
Um, we were saying cooking with coconut oil, add water first. So start off with a cold pan and bring the oil and the water to heat
To temperature.
together, and then add the food. Ideally using grass-fed butter, never margarines or spreads. They're just bad news.
Mm.
Eating wild organic fish, ideally twice a week. If you're vegetarian or vegan, you might look at flax seeds, chia seeds, walnuts as plant-based versions. Now, it's not a direct correlation because we have linoleic acid and alpha linoleic acid, and one is omega-3, one's omega-6, and the body doesn't convert one to the other that easily.
Mm.
So there's another vegetable source from um, algae that vegetarians might be able to use to
Mm.
get a really good source of DHA, but it is pretty hard to get EPA
Mm.
if you're vegetarian or vegan. So it might be worth, really investigating other options there. Avoiding farm fish, we mentioned. Avoid trans fats at all costs. They are banned in a lot of countries now where they were used a lot in baking goods and like that. The
Yeah,
10-year-old baked good Twinkie, as they call them in the States,
that
that
never go off. Yeah,
never go
survive
off.
nuclear winter nearly. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and equally, where the bacteria can't break down the food, our mitochondria that were of bacterial origin equally can't break down those trans fats. So they're definitely the worst of
Mm.
the lot. We said avoid potato chips, crisps, corn chips that are cooked in seed oils,
And deep
particularly.
fried food generally, like even at home,
Yeah,
deep frying is just it's mutating the oil to such an extent that it's a really, really harmful product. Now again, once in a blue moon,
yeah,
but that's not once a week.
yeah.
Once in a blue moon is a couple of times a year.
Yeah. So, if you're living out of the chipper, you want to rethink that. The chip shop here is, kind of a
I think
staple
most
for
people would be
some
familiar with,
people.
yeah, what a
Yeah.
chip shop is. Yeah.
Um, Avoiding commercially baked goods and confectionery. So biscuits, crackers, cakes, they just seem to be loaded with seed oils.
Mm.
And we mentioned then about the nuts, maybe avoiding dry roasted and roasted nuts.
And if you really like baked goods, start baking at home. It's not that complicated, and you can use really good ingredients and
Absolutely.
cut down on the industrial produced additives and use good fats.
Yeah.
You know, obviously, you still don't want to go overboard on high sugar foods, but if you want to have it as a treat now and again, the kind of 80-20 rule, you'd say, well, eat the healthiest version of the thing you like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think the takeaway is we don't want to be alarmist. The whole seed oils has really taken off, and it's like a bad word now. I think once you're using good quality cold pressed extra virgin olive oil at room temperature, that's going to be super healthy for you. But if you're getting into the cheaper oils, highly refined, highly processed, bleached, deodorized, all those, they're really not good for your health.
You had a couple of top two or three. We were saying cottonseed has to be at the top of the list.
Yeah.
Next was
Uh,
peanut oil.
Peanut oil that tends to be used
And was there another
extensively,
one
that's used
that's
within
used widely in industrial process and ultra processed food because it's
canola
cheap?
or
Canola was the other one.
rapeseed.
Yeah,
Yeah,
those three.
those three really
Yeah,
look out for those.
yeah.
So that's it, folks. That's just to give you the heads up on looking at the sugar content in food and the fat content, and trying to make sure you're getting the healthy fats and reducing the damaged fats, and really staying away from trans fats.
Yeah, and I'd highly recommend Udo's book and his oils,
Yeah.
Fats That Heal, Fats That Kill. I'm pretty
Yes.
sure it's still in print. You can still get a copy of it. And we'll put a link in the show notes to Robert Lustig's video. He had a nice, you said, little concise
Yeah,
4-minute
4-minute
video.
video that
So
explains the different categories and what foods they're in, and
yeah,
just have good swaps for, this is really bad, but you can use this instead.
yeah. So check out the show notes and we'll include that. Anything else we mentioned about Udo? Udo actually does have a range of oils. They were quite popular, a little bit harder to get maybe now.
Yeah,
Oh, the one thing we talked about was when you get cold pressed oils. We didn't quite come to that. So Udo actually has a section in his book where he talks about this. He worked with industry to say to genuinely produce a cold pressed oil. What they mean when they say cold pressed is they didn't add heat to extract more oil.
yeah,
But he said the mechanical compressing of the ingredients, whatever oil you're producing, that mechanical force generates heat sufficient to turn the oil rancid anyway.
Yeah.
So he actually designed a water-cooled press that would keep the contents and the oil and the quality of the fat low, the temperature low and the quality of the fat high. And it was just, they said, not commercially viable. It
Yeah.
would make it a little bit more expensive. So hopefully that technology will come into common use, and the oils that we're getting that are widely available are going to start being a little bit healthier. But I just thought that was an interesting thing, that just because it says cold press doesn't mean it was actually cold. Obviously, cold press is better than not because there isn't as much heat, it's not as damaged.
Hmm.
But first pressing, extra virgin, cold, organic is going to be the best really that we can get for something like an olive oil, and single source as well,
Yeah.
that it hasn't been diluted with cheaper oils.
Yeah. So if you have a tendency to inflammation, particularly to skin conditions, really look at the oils in your diet and where they're coming from.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Is there anything else?
Oh, all good.
And as usual, then remember to like, subscribe, and if you enjoy these and want to help support us, be sure and subscribe to our streaming service, watchhcd.ie, where we post these videos first. Or you could go onto our online shop and think about getting some of our new merchandise, where we have different cups and hoodies and things in that are really quite good for
Yeah.
general use. You don't have to be a therapist.
Yeah.
So think about supporting us if you can.
I'd like to congratulate Aubrey on being on the front of our industry magazine,
Yeah, the
from
Journal for
Australia.
Massage and Myotherapy. Yes,
Yeah,
yeah,
featured on the cover, and
yeah.
yeah,
We might post some of those articles maybe on our website at a later date.
yeah,
Okay, so I think we're there. That's it.
yeah.
All good. Thanks for watching, folks, and we hope to see you again next time.
See you next time. Bye bye.
Bye.